right. Can's Future Days came out August 1973. We last talked about them in episodes 13 and 15.
And we need the numbers, Josh.
I was gonna ask you that.
Were you?
Yes, right now. Tell me the numbers.
Number 94 of the 1970s. We almost didn't cover this, Josh, much to your chagrin. Number 10 in 1973, number 378 of all time. It is not on Rolling Stone's list.
Okay. This is their fourth studio album, their fifth overall, and the last to feature vocalist Damo Suzuki. After their last album that we talked about, Eya Bamasi, Can continued to tour, and then in mid-1972, Michael Caroli of the band suffered a perforated ulcer and almost died, and forcing Can to stop touring and even stay out of the studio. While he was recovering, Jackie Liebzit and Holger Zuke produced a record for solo artist Alex, whoever that is, and Zuke released an album titled Connexius 5, an album of montage sound pieces. So go check that out. They also started having some financial worries at this time because they weren't touring. So Schmidt's wife, Ermin Schmidt's wife, Hildegard, got a bank loan for the band and kept them afloat. With Michael Caroli recovered, they set up a 60-date tour covering the UK, France, and Germany. And they, in the spring of 1973, they returned to the studio in the summer of 73. And right as they were going to go into the studio, Damo Suzuki went back to Japan right as recording started. Now, they recorded in the same space they recorded last time, that Inner Space Studios, which was that converted theater in Cologne that they used.
Yeah,
and
where did this get recorded? I want to hear.
Yeah,
in an airport.
No, this is the same place, but this time, okay. But this time they have some upgraded equipment, and so they started recording. Zuke was not the sound engineer at this time, instead focusing just solely on the bass, as well as editing and cutting after the fact. They brought in some roadies to handle the sound engineering. And then Suzuki came back from Japan eventually, but most of the album was already finished and leaving little room for the vocals that you hear on the album. Sales did not match the previous two albums, and this is kind of their final swan song in terms of most influential albums and I guess popularity. Suzuki left shortly after the band left the band after finished recording. He married his girlfriend and became a Jehovah's Witness. And then Caroli and Schmidt took over on vocals on future albums, but fewer tracks featured vocals at all. So it's kind of they've fully transitioned in this album into kind of what they, I think, became ultimately with the ambient music. After this, they released 6 more albums in the 70s. The next one was called Soon Over Babaluma, and that continued in the ambient style as well. Then follow-ups after that were called Landed and Flow Motion, and they were more conventional, and you even had a disco single on it called I Want More that was popular in the UK. And because of that popularity, they went on Top of the Pops. John mentioned Top of the Pops last week, I believe, and so I thought that was a funny coincidence. And then in 1977, former Traffic artists, band members Roscoe G and Rebop Kwaku Ba, they joined the band.
Sounds about right.
Rebop Kwaku Ba?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
They joined the band and provided vocals on their final 3 albums. Zuke left the band in 77 due to dissatisfaction over the band's direction and with his bass playing. I guess Roscoe G was a well-known bass player, and so he kind of took over for that as well.
Wait, so what was the direction he was hoping for that he was disillusioned with?
It didn't say.
Chair?
Yeah,
Okay.
They didn't say. I guess, but I didn't listened to any of these later albums, so I think they kind of go all over the place.
Like,
really.
Did he want them to write 3-minute pop songs? Was that what he was hoping for? Because I feel like there's a lot of space in art rock and experimental rock to kind of.
Well, he's got a bunch of. Zuke's got a bunch of solo albums, so you can go check him out, John.
Yeah, I'm
just laughing.
Maybe
I think
he
of
was
the idea
even
that,
more avant-garde than the rest of the band. I don't know. I can only speculate.
Perhaps we do more melody. Perhaps we do more rhythm. Yeah. So
The band went their separate ways after the album, self-titled album in 1979, and they performed. The members performed as session musicians for other artists at that time, and later on in the decades. They reunited in '86 to record another album, released in '89, titled Right Time, and then that was their last official release as a band. They reunited in '91 and '99 for some single tracks on other projects, including a movie by Wim Wenders, and that's about it. Caroli died of cancer on November 17th, 2001. Jackie Liebzit died of pneumonia on January 22nd, 2017. And Holger Zuke died of natural causes on September 5th, 2017. And Erwin Schmidt is the sole surviving member of the original lineup at age 84. So that's kind of the history since... this is the last album we're talking about, and we've only got 4 tracks on this album. So let's start with Matt. What did you think of Future Days?
Yeah, I liked it, and I'm starting to think that Can is my favorite artist that we've covered in this entire podcast that I had no idea about before. Overall, because I know I would say I think the Pretty Things album, I still always go back to that as like maybe my favorite surprise album. But we only covered one Pretty Things record, and I don't know anything else by them. But I really like Can. It's such a unique listen. It's I think the only thing I didn't like about them was the second half of Tago Mago, which I kind of don't really count because it's just noises that they were making. They weren't even trying to make music. It was just sound effects and trying to experiment with stuff, which whatever, but the music, when they're doing music, I like it. And I see we've talked about this before, but this is certainly laying the groundwork for a lot of indie rock and, experimental stuff that, there's Radiohead in here, one of my favorite bands. Love the percussion against up front. Moonshake. What a freaking, that's like one of their best.
Song, really.
Yeah, that is a great, that is just a very danceable, very catchy kind of song. Future Days, really like that song as well. This grew on me a little bit. I listened to it a couple times, and the more I listened to it, the more I liked it. Bel Air, I found kind of an interesting listen in that there were times where I was really into it, and other times where I was like, okay, it's just there. But it kind of wavered back and forth, really. And I felt like maybe it had to do with the mood that I was in, or how I was listening to it. I think the times that I liked it more, I was listening to it on a headset. And I think that was just, I don't know, I was just putting it directly to my brain, and that maybe, made it like it a little bit more. But
it's also a 20-minute long song too. So
it is also a 20-minute long song. Yes. I don't know if it needs to be 20 minutes long, but it's fine. I sometimes with these longer songs, I can kind of, I don't mind it if it's something that that's got some aspects of it that I like. You can continue with it. So they're interesting because they are certainly not, obviously they're not traditional music. It's not that like I said, I like a lot of melody and and stuff like that, and this is not that at all. But it's just a lot of interesting sounds that they're doing. I love the drumming. I think that's probably my favorite part, and that's usually up front. That's usually something that you're kind of really hearing, and the stuff that you're hearing in the background, the guitar parts or the vocals, it's really way in the background, so but they still provide interesting elements to it. Like on Future Days, there's that cool little guitar part that they're plucking that a little bit. It's kind of I don't even know how to describe it. It's almost like I get like the sense of like an island kind of sound, like a beach, kind of thing. It was like a happy tone, because the music like this can get very dark, it can lend itself to being very, ominous and like, either depressing or scary or haunting, stuff like that. And I I wouldn't say that I feel that way with the majority of the songs that they're doing, whether it's here or on other albums. It's kind of upbeat and in some cases happy, like happier or brighter sounds. And it's just a very interesting band. I don't really listen to a ton of stuff like this. Like that's foremost, there's elements of this in other bands, but they also are couched more in melody and traditional rock and Western sounds. But yeah, I did Can. I was a fan. And I liked all 4 of these tracks. I don't think there was a dud on here for me. So it's an interesting listen, and I'm thumbs up on it.
All right, John, what did you think?
Well, the most interesting thing about this album is when we're listening to it, because with Station to Station from Bowie, we see the beginning of the krautrock influence on Bowie, very much on the first track, which we'll talk about when we get there, and certainly in the other 3 albums we're going to do. But I listened to Can first in our albums this week before the re-listen, and then I listened to each album first, so then I got Bowie later, and then I went back to Can, and it's just very clear with that Eno album we did and stuff, how much that sound, that German sort of ambient sound, found music sound, music concrete at times, you could see how it influenced some of the groups that we're listening to. And that's a really cool thing about doing this podcast, is seeing the influence. I know Matt constantly talks about indie rock and the influence on, and there is some of that, right? It depends on what we're talking about with indie rock, right? Because there's some.
I'm using it like, it's like an umbrella term for just kind of like maybe more unique or more. I don't want to say avant-garde because it's not full blown like avant-garde, but just different, surprises, songs that are kind of taking different directions and stuff like that is kind of more what I'm talking about.
And certainly Radiohead could be classified as indie rock, I guess, by what I hear in this is electronic music.
Yeah.
This is the beginning of way more than indie rock.
That's a good point.
So 80s, like it's very interesting too, because with electronic music in the 80s and 90s in particular, you can go real high art, like what Trent Reznor does at times, and Aphex Twin and stuff, and then you can do very mainstream stuff that became that was derivative of this, like Depeche Mode or Erasure, bands like that. But it seemed like there were elements of this that were merged with pop rock in the 80s and 90s all over the place. Like it became poppy, it became mixed with soul, it stayed weirder at times, and it became the music concrete and stuff like that. But this is where you start to see it all kind of come together, because you've got Roxy Music doing the new romantic thing. You've got sort of this sound coming out, and we haven't even gotten to Kraftwerk yet, guys, which is really interesting, because we've covered like every other big band of German rock, and we haven't covered the one that gets mentioned most when you talk about it. So that'll be very interesting when we do that. But as for the album itself, it certainly is at least a little bit more rooted in sounds that would be familiar to you if you've been mostly listening to Western rock music. That's not to say at all that it's really moored to that sound, but there are, I guess, what you would consider to be a little bit more traditional singing, a little bit more traditional playing on this album. They have a lot of very interesting, I just think it's interesting, like Bel Air ends the album, it's almost a 20-minute clip, and then it just stops. There's no outro, there's no real reveal that it's going to stop. It just ends, to the point where I thought that, like, I was listening to it, one of the 2 times I listened to it, I was listening to it actually on a phone while I was driving and speakers, and it stopped. I thought I was getting an incoming call or something, which, when you're listening to like this music, you always wonder, is that incoming call that I could be getting the music? Or so there's always that element of it too, which is kind of funny. But I'm not as effusive in love with this music. This music is more interesting to me than it is enjoyable for me, if that makes sense. I am really enjoying listening to this music, understanding it better, and applying it both to music that I know and maybe like a little bit more later. But I'm gaining a much greater appreciation for how this was sort of reinventing a sound. in the 70s. I will say that there were a couple tracks that I like almost better than any other Can stuff that we've done up to this point. I did like Bel Air. It's long, but it's interesting. I found the whole album, guys. Would you say it's like a dreamscape almost is how I would describe it.
Yeah.
The first two albums were harsh to listen to, very
Yes.
harsh to listen to. This is not an easy listen, but it's not a harsh listen. It's more I wouldn't certainly call it like soothing or anything, but it's sort of like a hypnotic dreamscape, I'd say.
Yeah,
that
it's a very relaxed sound, I would say.
Well, it's sort of like a soundscape. Like if you listen to like a beach house, like in modern bands, there's like beach house and real estate and bands like that. They have sort of a sound, but this is that sound. But whereas they stay just in the mellow, right? This jerks you out of it all the time. But this is a much less ominous listen than the other ones are. This is more one you can put on and blend into.
Yeah, there's an ambient, feel to it for sure.
Yes.
I think ambient's kind of the key word for the band at this point and going forward in the future.
Atmospheric would be another word that I would use. I think is a good one for those that haven't done it. But
chill wave.
Chill, yeah. But it's very interesting because it's sort of that abandonment of Western rock traditions that krautrock always sounds like to me. But also in this one, you do have elements of I more and more as I listen to this, guys, I think of it like classical music and to some extent jazz too. In that it's definitely rooted in a musical tradition, but it's not necessarily rooted in a rock and roll R&B tradition. And that's where I go, well, what's this tradition? And jazz is harder to tie it to because jazz is in some ways rooted to a Western tradition. It's Western music, right? But classical, I think, is what I would say. It's similar
I would say Spray in particular. You say jazz, and that's I forgot that. I was thinking of like Miles Davis fusion stuff, like in a silent way. I thought that there were sounds in there. Obviously, there's no trumpet, but like there wasn't a ton of trumpet in the silent way either. There was a lot of that, the keyboards and the bass and stuff like that. But I was hearing elements of that as well. So I definitely heard the jazz there too.
Yeah, so I would say thumbs in the middle for me, but I'm very glad I listened to this and very glad in general that I've expanded my horizons by doing the deep dives into whether it be New or Faust or Can, the groups making this type of music. It's been a real interesting journey, and it's been it's made me a more well-rounded, better listener of music to have dug into this a little bit. So, but Josh, what do you think?
Well, I was going to say, Zuke is quoted as saying that Bel Air showed Can in a state of being an electric symphony group performing a peaceful, though sometimes dramatic landscape painting, unquote. So
wow, that sounds like what I just said.
Yeah.
Wow,
I wanted to bring that up because that kind of mirrors what you said.
Well, I guess, am I going to become a Jehovah's Witness? Like at some
that's
point
not
in
Zuke.
Drop
That was
Society?
just the vocalist.
Oh, that's not, okay, Zuke, okay, the vocalist. Okay, gotcha.
I think it's kind of remarkable that the kind of transition that they've made from where we started with Tago Mago, because that was such an abrasive album, especially on the back half. And I think they really, based on what I read, this is kind of what they ultimately wanted to do or like to do, is create this ambient music. And that's kind of what their legacy is not only the ambient music, which I hear a lot of. On this album, I hear a lot of like dance music and then like electronic music too, and that's their other legacy. I heard a lot of like LCD sound system on this, and I could easily see adding certain things to the tracks on this, and it could be becoming a dance album easily.
It's like a skeleton, isn't it? And you could take it and you can make LCD sound system. You could take it and you can make Depeche Mode. You could take it and make Nine Inch Nails. See, they all went different directions, right? So yeah,
there's you get lulled into a groove on this album a little bit, and I really like Moonshake. That's kind of a great short little pop song that they insert. But Future Days and Spray and then Bel Air all have this kind of lilting, beachy sound that Matt said. I wrote that down too. It's gentle. There's and then I think Spray has kind of like an African beat to it too. There's some elements of world music that they're incorporating, I feel like, into this, and then they even have wave sounds in Bel Air at the beginning. So I think that plays into the kind of back and forth quality that this ambient music brings to the sound. I liked the album. I didn't love it. I think I liked Ea Bamasi more, but I appreciate it. And like you, John and Matt, I'm glad that we're listening to the krautrock. It's different than what I assumed it would be. It's not as abrasive as I assumed it would be, or harsh. And yeah, and I appreciate seeing the foundations for all of this other stuff that comes down the road. So yeah, this is good. Can is a band that I will appreciate hearing again, but I don't really have any desire to keep listening to their albums that come after this. I feel like I kind of, with these 3 albums, got a handle. I feel like it's representative of who they were as a band, and their progression. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Matt will listen to more and say, "Oh, it's like way different."
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I don't know if I have like a strong desire to go listen to a bunch more. I really enjoyed this. I was just taken by surprise when we first listened to Tago Mago. I remember how surprised I was right off the bat from the first track, because I thought it was going to be more of like I was expecting more of like a Trout Mask replica, kind of just like really noisy, yeah, just like very kind of like experimental. I mean, you guys have both said that, you know, that those other albums were harsher, or you know, like a harsher listen.
Yeah.
And my memory doesn't serve. My memory's not telling me, oh, that was a harsh listen. You know, there was a lot of. Maybe it was just I was expecting it to be a really harsh listen, but it wasn't. I found it pretty, you know, I enjoyable, like right off the bat. So I would agree. I think that this is more of a mellow kind of like ethereal, you know, setting to it. But I still don't think that I wouldn't say that those other albums were like this abrasive, harsh. I don't know if I don't know if those are words that I would use.
Yep.
But I just think it's interesting. And again, I don't know if I'm going to listen to this a ton more times, but here and there, yeah, sure. This is good stuff, man. And you're right, John. Electronic is a much better way of putting it. 'Cause it's interestingly enough, that word didn't come up in my mind, like in thinking about all those 80s bands and stuff like that, you know, in the moments of listening. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that's really what this is kind of, you know, laying the groundwork for, helping to create. So I was looking more at the beats and kind of like the off beats, and just, you know, like random notes here and there, and just kind of, you know, just the off-putting kind of, not off-putting, but like the offbeat nature of things, more so. But you're right, electronic is a good way to say it as well.
Yeah, I think the final takeaway I want to leave for Can is their legacy. They're a foundational part of krautrock and early pioneers of electronic music and ambient music, and they've influenced many artists that we've talked about. Also, they seem to get a lot of bands to name their bands after. There's a band called Mooney Suzuki that's named after 2 members of Can. We talked about Spoon, one of my favorite bands, and how they were influenced by them. There's a British rock band in the 90s called Moonshake, named after this track. And then, you know, the early pioneers of ambient music, along with Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream. I don't know if we'll talk about Tangerine Dream, but they are... I hear them. They've been in so many movies and music.
They had the
scores
they had the theme song for the '80s TV show Street Hawk. I don't know if you ever remember seeing that, but that was, yeah.
Wow.
Can't say I have.
And you know who was in Street Hawk was the guy from Murphy Brown. Was Murphy Brown's friend Frank. He was in one of the actors in Street Hawk. So yeah. Yep.
Okay.
There you go.
Not the first thing I would think of for Tangerine Dream, but that's why
what
Matt and I are different.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's Can in a nutshell. And it sounds like we're all appreciative and generally positive on Can as a whole, and so check them out and listen to those albums.
Yep.